what I do want to do is talk about something which I'm quite passionate about, is health tech and the future of health tech. So when I was asked to give this talk, I tried to think in terms of what opportunities exist today, what challenges, and a little bit of inspiration for those here who are practitioners, who are innovators, but also, I guess, the investors and even the users. So my background is in science. I did work early in my career in IT consulting 20 years ago. Moved back into science and did a lot of work in medical imaging, and then transitioned back into corporate world as a startup chief scientific officer, a startup based in Vienna. And I saw a lot there. We were selling a solution for AI in radiology. And I think a lot of my experience comes from that, and also from helping other startups and small enterprises in medtech. A lot in software, also in some hardware and implantables. So what drives the opportunities? It actually is unmet needs of the market, including the rising healthcare costs, which you didn't actually talk about, but this is really one of the big issues. Costs of healthcare are rising across Europe, and there's a need to save money. In many industries, I just heard it from the next room, saving an hour in the construction industry saves money, which is seen on the bottom line. Healthcare is a little bit more complicated, but you still have the ability to minimize costs with technology. Clinical workforce shortages, this is becoming, I would say, somewhat of an epidemic in certain parts of healthcare, especially in radiology, the area where I come from. There is more and more data being pushed into the system, more imaging, faster imaging. Radiologists, we're not creating more radiologists. So in a way, the technology advances creating part of the clinical workforce shortage, but ultimately there's more and more demand, and we need some way to account for that demand. Aging population is a very big issue. We know that the population is skewing towards being older, people are getting healthier, living longer. It costs more from a healthcare perspective to treat older patients. Health inequities. Again, very good point made at the beginning. The mental health patients are often not being addressed. Across Europe, there's very big inequities between different nations, different regions, different people in terms of access. And finally, competition from non-traditional players, which is interesting because it's an issue for the traditional system. The traditional healthcare networks, the payers, the insurances, the providers. But we here are actually the non-traditional players. The technology that we're bringing into the market with digital technology, with advances in imaging, diagnostics, are challenging the traditional players to catch up. So we have an opportunity to work with them to disrupt them. And that's exactly what I wanted to talk about today, which is digital disruption. Although health tech is big, I think given the nature of this conference and the audience, I want to try and focus somewhat on digital disruption. So what does this look like? So it has many forms. Some of you might be familiar, but I want to go through very quickly. Personalized medicine is definitely a big topic in digital disruption. Apps, diagnostic tools, the amount of data that we can acquire about a patient gives us the ability to personalize their treatment pathways. And this is a value for the patient, it's a value for the provider, and for the healthcare system. Artificial intelligence, I don't need to say too much about this. From my background in radiology, this is booming. But as much as there are applications on the market that you can buy, I don't think we've yet seen anything that's as disruptive as we'd like to. And I think there's a number of reasons. Most of it has to do with adoption and some issues which I'll go into later. Interoperable data. Data interoperability has a big impact on the ability to scale. Scaling has been challenging for a lot of digital startups in healthcare and a lot of startups in healthcare. So I think interoperable data, which is being addressed at a European level, is playing a role. Virtual healthcare assistants. I don't know how many of you have been aware of or work within the AI scribe field, but a digital or virtual healthcare assistant is designed to aid the healthcare providers in any number of ways. One of them being the ability to automate note-taking clinical scribes. This technology is amazing when you think about it. You talk to your doctor, you talk to your nurse, you talk to your provider, and the notes are produced. And this takes a lot of time when you're dictating and you have somebody typing this. However, we know that generative AI hallucinates. And there's been some really interesting cases just yesterday I read about where hallucination is leading to things being put into the notes which were not said and which are quite dangerous. So I think we will get there, but it will take more time. Mobile health, I think this is pretty obvious between mobile devices and wearable devices, the integration of the two, the data that it's generated. I think this is one area where health tech is being pushed directly to the user and the patient, which is quite exciting. I would almost categorize the latest development from Apple with their AirPods, which actually are used as a hearing aid. In some way, it is a mobile health application, but it shows you the level or the size of a company you need to be able to distribute a technology at scale across a large population. And finally, digital twins, which is a really cool way of saying simulation. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with this, but this is really the way in which you can simulate a patient or a patient's system in a digital way. And there's a lot of research here. This maybe goes into the research a little bit, but it's quite evolving. So why is all of this hard? Why is it difficult to put products on the market and scale? The 4 main reasons I'll talk about. Fragmented European markets. We're in Czechia. I'm sure you're all aware of that. You know what it's like to live here, to access healthcare here. Things are different across borders. Things are sometimes different across regions. In Austria, where I live, every region has its own health authority. The who pays problem. If you haven't heard this as a startup yet and you're in healthcare, you're either doing an amazing job or you haven't gotten to the point where you've figured out who is paying for my solution. If you're an investor, it's the question you're asking. The processing of personalized health data, it's the core of digital disruption, but it's also extremely sensitive and difficult to navigate. And finally, the evolving regulatory landscape. I can't stress enough how important it is that digital startups, healthcare startups, really tackle the regulatory landscape. They have to own it. So I just want to talk briefly in detail about this fragmentation of the EU markets. What we see here is the healthcare expenditure per inhabitant for 2021. There's an 8-fold difference between the highest and the lowest in terms of euros. So Luxembourg being over 6,000, Romania being under 1,000 per inhabitant. It looks a little better when you normalize it for purchasing power, but it's still a 3-fold difference, which means that richer nations are spending 3 times more than, let's say, poorer nations or less rich nations in Europe on healthcare. And in Czechia, just as an example, since we're here, you're at about 2,000 per person, but with purchasing power, it actually goes up to about 3,000 purchasing power points. So it's right in the middle in terms of what is being spent per inhabitant on healthcare. So that's one aspect of fragmentation. But if we look a little deeper, we see maybe the crux of the problem for scalability. And when you look at the source of financing, you have government schemes in blue, you have compulsory schemes in yellow, and you have other schemes or other funding in red. And we see that over 80% of healthcare expenditure comes from the first 2, compulsory or governmental schemes. And actually, interestingly enough, Czechia is the highest in Europe, over 86%. So in each member state, although you have this 80%, in some member states, especially skewing to the left here in Scandinavia, the government is paying for most of healthcare. In other member states, you have a two scheme. You have a government scheme and a compulsory scheme. And this leads to the question, if you're bringing something to market, who is going to pay for it? So I like to call the who pays problem, it's very simple. If you're building a health technology solution and you aren't sure who pays for it, you have a problem. And this is what I've seen from my personal experience. You can have great tech, and your tech is great. It's amazing. What we do is you have to take a step back and realize that what we're capable of doing in healthcare technology today is unprecedented. But it doesn't mean that people will pay for it. So there's 4 main groups that you have to consider for paying. The first are the patients. The patients are, let's say, the easiest to access, but the most difficult in terms of how much you can charge and the ability to scale. Providers is where I think a lot of health tech companies, startups go. They go to doctors, they go to hospitals. There's a lot of relationships built. And this is great, except oftentimes the stakeholders who want your solution are not the ones responsible for making decisions. So you have to go to the payers. The payers, the large insurances, this is really where health tech startups are starting to move, who see the ability to scale. And I think there's some movement happening, but it takes a lot of time. You have to come up with a way to get reimbursement. You have to prove the clinical value or the clinical benefit or the systemic benefit of your solution. And finally, I think maybe personally a more approachable way to determine who pays is health tech partners. So within the industry, if you have a technology which is beneficial to pharma, to medical devices, to other digital solution providers, or even to other solution providers, it's often easier to find the value proposition there and work with them. So I'll go over this very quickly. As I mentioned, processing of personal data, it's pretty well known. You need a good strategy. There are a lot of legal requirements, and cybersecurity is becoming a major problem. It's a huge problem. Hospital systems, doctors, insurance companies are all dealing with ransomware attacks because the data is so valuable on the black market, unfortunately. In terms of regulatory landscape, we all know about the GDPR. It's actually a little bit quaint to talk about now when you look at what's come after it in terms of medical regulation, but it's still very important. The medical device regulation and the IVDR, the in vitro device regulation, both extremely substantial if your device or your solution is considered a medical device or an IVD. If you're not sure, you better find out, because if you start selling a product which turns out to be a medical device, you will have a lot of problems. The EU AI Act, this is new. It's coming into force in stages, and it isn't harmonized with the other two. So a lot of companies are still waiting to see how to harmonize their regulatory strategy, especially if you have an AI-enabled device. Health technology assessment regulation. This might not affect startups so much, but in terms of health systems, up until now, every country was responsible for assessing the impact of health technology from an economic and a patient standpoint, and the EU is now trying to centralize that. I have no opinion as to whether or not this will be better or worse, but they're trying to address the inequities and trying to make it possible to share experience from one system to another when a new technology is being introduced clinically. The European health data space, maybe it doesn't fall under regulatory yet, but the idea of standardizing and making data more interoperable should help all stakeholders. And finally, and NIS2, this is really on the IT and tech side. This is to address cybersecurity. But if you are working in the cloud, if you have a marketplace, you need to be aware of whether this affects you. So it's a lot. And I think you might not have heard of this one, the Health Expectancy Lifetime Program Medical Environment. Help me. This is how you feel when you've been working in regulatory affairs for a long time. But there is help. So on the investment side, the investors are meeting the challenges. This comes from scaling growth. The European digital health funding has reached 3.5 billion in 2024, and it's up almost 20% from 2023. And most interestingly, strategic partners are up 13%, especially with pharma. So going back to the idea that you can actually grow maybe faster or more sustainably by partnering with big corporates. AI-driven healthcare is dominating, 61% of the total funding. However, only 25% of the early-stage AI ventures have raised in the past 18 months. So scaling is hard, and I think a lot of smaller enterprises are hitting a wall because they haven't found that value proposition. They haven't figured out who pays, or they just can't scale fast enough. So maybe to hit that a little bit more, there is early-stage promise, but there is scaling uncertainty. There are a lot of investors, 3,000 early-stage investors and over 3,500 digital health ventures. Since 2019, over $7.1 billion US dollars have been invested in Europe, almost 1,500 deals, and 1,900 unique investors. And leading areas are oncology, women's health, and mental health, as mentioned before. But the performance of the growth stage is still on shaky ground. So there's a huge opportunity there. Since I'm running out of time, I just wanted to highlight a few more resources for health startups from governmental agencies. And also note, in Germany, you may know this, the digital health applications regulation or law is making it easier to bring apps to market. I don't know if Czechia has something similar, but if you do, then that's great. You don't, okay. And yeah, these are some sources of hope. So I just want to leave you with a few keys to success from my experience, from other companies' experience. The first one, your tech is amazing. Let it speak for itself. And what I mean is, don't talk about it too much. There's a reason. Let the users help you discover the value of your tech. I think in medical practice, especially when engineers and scientists build something amazing, they love it, but the user has to figure out how it fits into their ecosystem. And then design your solution to deliver on that value, not on the other things that you might think are amazing. Prove the value with strong clinical evidence. It can't be said enough. All of these stakeholders need to see that in order to pay. Engage various stakeholders to solve the who pays problem once you have your clinical evidence. And develop strong data strategies, clinical strategies, and regulatory strategies. The investors will look very hard at these things. And seek the investors and partners who understand both digital and health. I can tell some stories about this situation where it was very difficult to engage the investors when they just didn't understand health tech or med tech enough. So it's really important to choose your investors as much as you can. And I think that's it. I'll leave you there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. We are a little bit running out of the time, but still I would like to ask you some questions because you answered most of the questions which audience gave already through the application. If you don't use the application for the questioning, please use it in the future because it's really helpful and I see the questions here. And I have actually one question connected with the strategy, how to involve the partners in a way that you will succeed and you will actually scale. Right. Because for example, I had a client, perfect clinic, they have all the solution done. They had clients, they had names, they had everything done. But still there is like 5 years of the process to get the license to use the 3D printing tools in during the surgery or whatever. Mm-hmm. So they need to wait 5 years. Or they will join the corporation, but they will lose actually the ownership and to lose the startup drive in that case. Is there any other working strategy which startups can choose to?
I can't speak directly to that specific situation, but I think it's important to understand the area where you're working. If you're working closely with clinics and hospitals and university clinics, realize that some of the same clinical problems are being addressed by pharmaceutical companies, by medical device companies. Look at the indications if you're focusing on specific indications. Look at the clinical trials that are being run. Look at the pipelines. Do your research into how your specific tool might be addressing outcome measures, which are extremely valuable for the corporates. And be aware of the drug pipelines, the device pipelines. I worked in the orthopedic space as well, so it was a lot about medical devices. And talk to your partners about what's happening in those pipelines. And from the tech standpoint, in terms of engagement, certainly if you have a digital app, you have to be willing to, approach the big players, the Microsoft or Nuance in the US, Apple, and any big player. Don't be afraid to make an approach, but use your network. Maybe use your investors as well to make a good approach.
So you need a strategic investor in case of health tech. That's the most helpful. One more question, because I'm sorry that a few questions stayed not answered, but I think that it's time to check the networking and get coffee with Matthew to get all the informations.
Yes.
But I have last question. Maybe what will be the question I supposed to ask you during the beer session in the night? What's your passion you want to talk about with me?
Well, I guess going back to the idea of health tech, a lot of inspiration came to me during the pandemic because I binge watched Star Trek: The Next Generation. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but so many of the things that we're trying to do now with health tech are so clearly laid out in that 7-season, 250-episode series. It was a long pandemic. So I think the vision is there. And people who are long dead took that vision and made it into a sci-fi miniseries or series. But I think a lot of the things we want to accomplish have been shown to us, and we have to not be afraid to look at these amazing ideas and say, we have the technology now to build towards that.